Saludos todos. My name is Kimberly Roa. I am the Special Projects Coordinator for the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, and we are so happy to have you here today for our library lunch hour on 20th century Puerto Rican migration. I am happy to introduce our Library and Archives Manager, Anibal, who will be presenting his findings on the OGPRUS Identification Program. Did I get the acronym right, Anibal?
Yes, that is, we call it Agprus.
Agprus, yes. On the Agprus records and the information we have on 20th century migration and these valuable records that you can come see for yourself if you do want to visit the library in person. And without further ado, here's Anibal.
Hi, everybody. Welcome again to another library lunch hour. And this time, it's a reader's choice. So Kimberly was so kind as to create a survey to see what the listening public and the viewing public wanted to learn more about. And the public doesn't make it easy. So the selection was Puerto Rican migration. And so that's a very large topic. And as librarians, what we try to do is we try to take large topics and dive down into maybe specific subtopics. And I was trying to see what Centro has that is unique to Centro about Puerto Rican migration. And what came to mind immediately was this gigantic binder. So this gigantic binder is our binder of identification records from the offices of the government of Puerto Rico in the United States. The Puerto Rican government set up regional offices throughout the United States to provide services to newly arrived Puerto Rican migrants. Among that was identification services, creating a uniform identification standard for Puerto Ricans that arrived and needed identification forms. And as part of our archival records of the Office of the Government of Puerto Rico in the United States, we have all these applications. And I'm going to share a presentation with you about this resource and how all of you out there can access this resource. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So 20th century Puerto Rican migration, the Agprus Identification Program. The application for a certificate of identification is an English language document which contains the basic information usually requested of all immigrants to the United States. Puerto Ricans at the time were in a unique position among other immigrants. Although Puerto Rico was a possession of the United States since the Spanish-American War of 1898, Puerto Ricans prior to 1917 were considered neither foreigners nor citizens. The case of the Puerto Rican Isabel Gonzalez, who had been detained in Ellis Island in 1903, forced the Supreme Court to determine that Puerto Ricans were exempt from the usual interrogation procedures at Ellis Island. With the granting of citizenship in 1917, Puerto Ricans began migrating to the United States in increasing numbers. The migrants would fill out the application and provide supporting documents such as official birth, death, baptismal, marriage certificates, divorce papers, and other forms of identification. These were usually attached to the application. An Internal Revenue Service stamp was placed on the application and the ID card to prove that these were official documents sanctioned by the government of Puerto Rico. When migrants did not have birth certificates, a form letter from the ID program was then sent to Puerto Rico Department of Health requesting a certificate. Once all of these application requirements were fulfilled, the client received an identity card, which was valid for 2 years and renewable. Many referred to the card as La Tarjeta Saldaña because from October 1930 through June 1945, the cards were signed by Marco T. Saldaña, who was the chief of the identification service. Although the card was not mandatory, it was an extremely valuable document for proving American citizenship and easing the way for migrants. Other Latino immigrants sought to take advantage of this service, and soon both the US Immigration Service and Puerto Rican government were involved in trying to control the trade in false documents. Between 1930 and 1959, the ID program issued a total of 47,342 cards. All first-time applicants, as well as renewals, received an ID number. These applications provide unique testimony to the numbers and diversity of the people who migrated stateside. Each application contains the applicant's name, birth information, parents' birth information, New York City address, Puerto Rican address, occupation, physical description, including weight and height, eye, hair, and skin color, method of citizenship, emergency contact information. The application for women was different and included additional information about father or husband, applicant's marital status, and marriage state. The application is an invaluable document for researchers. It can help in the analysis of migratory patterns and the establishment of Puerto Rican communities through New York. Anyone interested in the racial characteristics of the migrants will find descriptions based on North American concepts as well as photographs. For those tracing their family history, this is also a valuable genealogical document. So for this presentation, I thought I would use an example of someone that's pretty famous, especially among the Puerto Rican community, and that's Bernardo Vega. I'm going to show you, I'm going to walk through what this resource looks like now. We've moved away from the gigantic binder where you have to search alphabetically, and we have, Centro has a database. And in this database, you can search through last names and first names, dates of births, maternal last names and hometowns, and find the actual application of the people that were applying for these ID cards. Sorry about that. Okay. And I chose Bernardo Vega because he is one of the more prominent individuals featured in this collection. And for those of you not familiar with Bernardo Vega, he was a Puerto Rican migrant that contributed to the understanding of the Puerto Rican community in New York City. He's from Calle. He was a tabaquero, but he wrote for the Hispanic population in Spanish newspapers. He was involved in politics. And most famously, he produced a memoir called The Memoirs of Bernardo Vega, which was published in 1977, which provides probably one of the most detailed accounts of the lives and struggles of Puerto Ricans arriving to New York City for the first time. So, you know, any major Puerto Rican oriented or Latina oriented library will have a copy of Memoirs of Bernardo Vega. So, you know, I entered Vega under last name and Bernardo under first name, and I got 2 hits. And I know Bernardo Vega Montañez, and I know Bernardo was from Calle, and we can see his date of birth. And this is important right here. We know that the box number and the application number. The box number refers to which box this application is physically located in. The actual documents are located in our offsite storage facility, in a controlled climate offsite storage facility. But all of these materials have been microfilmed to make them preserved and more readily available. And we also know that his application number is number 1525. With these 2 pieces of data, we can retrieve Bernardo Vega's original application for an ID card. And this is his application. We can see that it's number 1525, and it's an application for a certificate of identification. And this is what it looks like when you request a microfilm for this application. This was box 7, so this is the reel for boxes 6 through 8, and it contains documents that with the number 1305 through 1825. So this is exactly what we're looking for. And then we load it into our microfilm machine here, and then we get our application. We know he's from Calle. They still refer, in this application, they still refer to it as the island of Puerto Rico, but at this time in 1936, it had already reverted back to Puerto Rico. So I guess they just never updated the form. We know that he was born in January 14th, 1885. They say he was born on or about. Back in the day, there was a little haziness around people's birth dates. We have information about who his father is, his current residence. He was in Elmont, New York. That he was a citizen of the United States by act of Congress in 1917. So, and then his emergency contact information. This is Mrs. Livia Vega. And then we have his signature. We have the IRS stamps that we had mentioned. And Saldaña. La tarjeta Saldaña is because it was this gentleman who signed off on everybody's cards. And it was 1936 that he applied. So this is the other side of the application. Has his age, his height, his weight, his complexion is listed as fair. The gentleman has no distinguishing marks. We have a thumbprint, and then we have it's signed off by Mr. Saldaña again, and we have a little passport photo of Bernardo Vega. And this is probably a photo that not many people have ever seen before of Bernardo Vega, of him in his middle-aged years. And an additional document that was required was a letter from a witness. So this was Pedro Vasquez declaring his belief as Bernardo Vega, being a native of Puerto Rico, is entitled to the rights and privileges of American citizenship in accordance with the Act of Congress of March 2nd, 1917, granting said citizenship to all citizens of Puerto Rico. So with this application, with his physical information and his photograph and this letter of witness, he is able to receive an identification card signed off by Mr. Saldaña. Unfortunately, we don't have Bernardo Vega's identification card, but this is an idea of what the identification card looked like. So you had an image, you had the thumbprint, you had the bearer's signature, you had the IRS stamps, again, signed off by Mr. Saldaña. This was, remember, the people in the Puerto Rican communities called this La Tarjetita Saldaña. And in testimony whereof and by virtue of the authority by Act number 46 of the Legislature of Puerto Rico, approved April of 1930, this certificate of identification is issued in New York City, and this one was for Mr. Joseph Anthony Colon. So I know people will have a lot of questions. This is a resource that is available. This database is available by request. It's not a publicly facing page on our website simply because too much use of it can crash the website. So we want to make sure not everybody rushes to use it at the same time. For those of you that wish to make an appointment, Kimberly's going to drop the link to fill out the form to request an appointment to view this and any of the other documents that we have. If you have any questions, you can always email us here at the email address on the screen. If you want to come in and use the binders instead of the database, you can still come in and use the binder, and the binder will then take you to the microfilm, which will then take you to the applications. So I thought this was a cool resource to share about Puerto Rican migration. I hope all of you really enjoyed it. And let us know if you have any questions. Kimberly's going to send the form for the request for appointments. And yeah, there's a Q&A box if anybody has any questions. Okay, I see in the chat someone asked, what year did this start? This started in 1930. And it's a pretty easy to navigate resource. Once you get the box number and the application number, it's really easy to find the microfilm that corresponds to that box. And then just go scan through the microfilm reader and get the application. The program went until 1959. Someone asked, why, if this was voluntary, did so many apply for this card? That's a really good question. For a lot of people, it was a personal choice. A lot of people, it was a matter of pride, right? They wanted to exercise their newly acquired American citizenship, relatively new. Some people needed it for practical purposes. They were starting businesses, they needed to acquire loans, they needed to get mortgages. They traveled extensively. Those were some of the reasons. And a lot of the more prominent Puerto Rican communities, a lot of people actually didn't get this identification card because they never really traveled outside of their community. So they didn't need to prove anything to anybody. What documents did Puerto Ricans use to travel to the United States? Puerto Ricans would use their birth certificates a lot of the time, which was to this day, Puerto Ricans use their birth certificates for a lot of things. The government has tried to stop this for the most part, but for instance, if you wanted to sign your kid up for Little League, a lot of times they would ask for a birth certificate. It's famously like that all Puerto Ricans have at least 4 copies of their birth certificate. Recently, that's changed. Would recruiters looking for farm workers in Puerto Rico have requested these? That's a great question. I'm not entirely sure. I'm not sure if people with that had this identification card were more employable than others. Many times, if you wanted to join a union, or if you wanted to join like the Merchant Marines or become a dock worker, work for the customs service, they would want some form of identification. Oh, and we have some Q&A. Hi, Aníbal. If I understood you correctly, we can request access to the database and to use away from El Centro. That is correct? That is correct. If you want to access this remotely, what we can do is we can send you the link to use the database. And then you can tell us the box number and application number, and we can then send you a scan of that application. So you don't actually need to come into the library to use this information. You don't have to use this resource, I should say. You can do it totally remotely. A lot of people find it very fun to come in and use the physical resource. There's just something really fun about, going through microfilm and looking through binders that makes it feel like you're doing some really heavy research. All right, so can you say more about who trafficked in the falsification of the cards, Puerto Ricans and non-Puerto Ricans? If the former, why, since they were citizens? It was non-Puerto Ricans. When word got out that if you were Puerto Rican, you can get an identification card, there were a lot of people who suddenly thought it was very advantageous to be or claim that you were Puerto Rican. So different Latino groups would then try to get this form of identification. ¿Por qué en el estado de Connecticut los puertorriqueños nacidos en la isla ahora hay que usar los dos apellidos? Why in the state of Connecticut do Puerto Ricans born on the island now have to use both surnames? That's a really good question. I'm not familiar with that. But I'm sure there's probably someone in our audience from Connecticut who can provide further insight into that. And that is something that we can probably look into with a little more time if you wanted to email us at the Central Library reference email address. All right, any more questions? Was this mainly used for people traveling to New York? You could have applied, although since New York was one of the primary population centers, I believe you can apply to this card at any of the regional offices. So there was like one in Connecticut, there was one in New England, New Hampshire, and one in Delaware, among others. There are a bunch of offices where you can apply for this card. Yes, this is definitely something like we have a question that says, I work in a school district and so many students have the same name, Jose Arroyo, Michael Garcia. Yeah, this is always an issue when working with genealogy or any sort of family history study, is that there are lots of Jose Gonzalez, lots of, Miguel Rodriguez. That is why they use the second surname. They use the maternal last name in addition to the paternal surname. And so when you're doing your search, if you type in like Jose Rodriguez, for instance, you might get 80 or 90 hits. But that's why it's important to search by maternal surname as well. Yeah, that's thank you again for coming in all the way from Oakland, and it's early, it's pretty early in Oakland, so thank you. I appreciate that. We definitely try to accommodate people remotely. So yes, if you would like to use one of these resources remotely, we would be glad to help you provide scans of specific applications for you. We are, especially due to the pandemic, we are keenly aware that Centro has a lot of resources that are proprietary to us, and it's hard to get to New York now. It's hard to travel. And we're doing our best to try to make those resources available remotely. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions in the Q&A. Honestly, I'm surprised by how many people we have attending. The topic of migration and especially genealogical stuff can tend to be for people that are really into family history searches and less into general history. But I think there's a lot of really neat things that can be found looking through these applications. In my talk, I mentioned how we can gain insights into migratory patterns, into demographic information, even into the way that Puerto Ricans were described. We saw that Bernardo Vega was described as a fair-skinned man. And we have another question. Did the US government employ Puerto Ricans to interview the applicants? Yeah, the people who worked in the offices of the government of Puerto Rico in the United States were Puerto Ricans. And the officials who signed off on your forms were Puerto Ricans. Michael Saldaña. And I chose a prominent individual because like Fernando Vega, because so many people have heard of him, and we have his books here in English and Spanish, and that's another really cool thing. If you do get to come here, you can do things like look at the memoirs of Bernardo Vega, and then you can look at his application for an ID card in the archive. So not many places can offer you that experience of using books from our stacks and also archival resources. Did the cards include race? The cards didn't specifically include race. It just stated your height, your weight, your skin tone, and any distinguishing marks that you had. So like if you had a scar or like if you had a tattoo, if you had a gold tooth, if you were missing an appendage, those were all considered distinguishing marks. Brussels, Belgium. I thought Oakland was far. Thank you for attending. I wonder if all Puerto Ricans were required to obtain this ID card, and I wonder what document was used for Puerto Rican which were migrated to Hawaii, 1850 to 1925. This was not a requirement. It was a voluntary identification card. In many cases, it was easier to have a single identification card than having to walk around with baptismal certificates, marriage certificates, birth certificates. So the consolidation of all these documents into one ID card was very helpful. With regards to Hawaiian migration, this program started in 1930. So the Hawaiian migration predated this program, which meant most likely that Puerto Ricans that traveled, they traveled by steamship from Puerto Rico to Louisiana, then took a train, then arrived in San Francisco, and then took another steamboat. They were traveling most likely with their birth certificates. Okay. Question, why did the program end? The program went until fairly late. I think, yeah, it ended around 1960. So I think just at that point, and this is just me hypothesizing a little bit, I think at that point enough Puerto Ricans had established a community and had learned to navigate through the bureaucracy of the city, had gotten driver's licenses, had gotten passports, and had been enough time removed from 1917 that the concept of Puerto Ricans as citizens was not totally alien to most bureaucratic agencies. All right, so I mean, I can't tell you how floored I am by the response and by the idea that we have people from the West Coast, but also people from Europe. So that's awesome. So I answered that one. Who is a person that challenged the immigration process? Gladys, I'm not sure regarding any challenges to the immigration process. Are the applications that were submitted in other regional offices located in El Centro? As far as I know, yeah, we should have all of the applications. This was just one part of a gigantic collection that we received from the Puerto Rican government. So we received the farm labor records, we received the records of the migration division, and we received the identification program records. And we're talking thousands of cubic feet of documentation. In an agreement with the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, the Puerto Rican government gave us stewardship of all these documents. And a large portion of the documents have been microfilmed in order to provide ease of access. For anyone that's interested in this collection specifically, if you email me, I can also send you the guide to this collection. And the guide to this collection contains more detailed historic information about the identification program, the migration division, and the farm labor division. Did most of the migration occur from the mountains or from large cities? You know, I'm not entirely sure. This specific talk is about this identification program with one specific example, but there has been a ton written about Puerto Rican migration And if you'd like to learn more about migration patterns, I encourage you to reach out via our email, and I can provide links and scans of documents relating to migration patterns. Let's see. For migration of Puerto Rico to US, can you tell if there was one location from where a Puerto Rican did not travel from? That's going to be really tricky. If you wanted to conduct the research into seeing like which municipalities had the least amount of migrants, I'm sure that's something that can be done. But I wouldn't know off the top of my head. That's a pretty tricky question. But one that merits study. Let's see, we have, is Central still collecting these documents from personal sources? From time to time, we do get copies of people's identification cards as part of their donations, archival donations to Central. So yes, yeah, we do get them from time to time. There's a bit of information someone wants to share. Some Hawaiian immigrants, some stayed in San Francisco and formed the first Latino club in the USA, El Club Puerto Riqueño de San Francisco. Yes, that is correct. And Centro has documentation about El Club de San Francisco in our collections. I would imagine if it were me, I would be one of those people that stayed in San Francisco, because you would not be able to get me back on another boat after that long travel. It is amazing that so many made that trip. And it's also one of the areas of study that is really, really hot right now. People are very interested in these early Puerto Rican communities in Hawaii. Okay, another question. Were these IDs helpful for air travel? They were helpful for anywhere that you needed to gain access to improve your identification. Air travel was a lot simpler, I want to say, back then. So yes, I mean, they were certainly helpful because you needed to show some form of identification to purchase tickets. But most of the time, there was nothing like the TSA or the flight checks that they did, that they do now. What class of Puerto Ricans migrated to the mainland first? Was it the well-to-do or the poor? It certainly was a combination. But there was, especially in the early steamship travel, it was a lot of business people. So it was more people of means. It was people who were politically connected, who traveled. It was then a lot of air travel that really democratized the immigration experience. All right. And a lot of the early steamship travel, it brought people from San Juan to Florida, and also to parts of Cuba, and then into the New York area. So some people did it for tourism as well. It says, just as a suggestion, you may want to ask for collections from people on this chat who know anyone who we should all know about. We're doing that in Newark, New Jersey. We are trying to get people to donate their family documents. That's phenomenal. I think it's so great that people are trying to start their own archive. And we did our first library lunch hour about, what to archive and why people archive things, and a little bit about what Centro archives. I encourage anyone who wants to consider donating their materials to Centro to reach out to us, and we can begin that conversation. Why do you say that it's a hot topic of investigation? Is it based on what records you're being most used in your archive? That is a very good, yes, the very good question. It is anecdotal account by myself, the librarian, who fields questions, a lot of questions about Puerto Ricans in Hawaii. A lot of times it starts like this. It goes, wow, there were Puerto Ricans in Hawaii, and then we go from there. I've read some Puerto Ricans went to Ecuador and Panama. Do you have records of those? It's a really good question. I don't know if we have records of Puerto Ricans that went to Ecuador and Panama, but it merits investigation. Maybe not by me, but certainly by some people. Another question in the Q&A. Was the steamship called the Marine Tiger? The Marine Tiger was one of the most famous of the steamships, but there were several. There was the Coamo, there was the Borinquen, there was the one that Rita Moreno came in on called the Carabobo. So there were a handful of different steamships. During World War II, I believe the majority of these steamships were destroyed as they were put into military service. And then air travel came. Right. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Has there been any talk about strategies for beginning to scan or digitize Centro's vast document holdings? I think of the crowdsourced software the Smithsonian and the New York City Public Library use for the Global Digital Volunteers transcription of scanned documents. So Centro actually has a really robust digital collection. Kimberly, if you can put the link to our digital collections in the chat, I would greatly appreciate that. Centro has over 25,000 digital images and documents in our digital holdings. It represents several of our collections. We have over 300 collections, and not everything is digitized. Right now, we're working under funding from a National Endowment for the Humanities grant that is going to allow us to upload an additional 25,000 images by the end of the grant funding period. So yes, like we have a ton of digital material and are always adding more. And I encourage you all to check that out. We had a presentation, one of our library lunch hours was with our research associate, Elizabeth, who showed how she uses the digital collections in her research about education. So definitely go check out our digital collections. And unless we have any more questions, I think that's going to be it for today. Again, thank you, everyone. Thank you to our people that are attending from different time zones. Thank you for giving this friendly neighborhood Puerto Rican librarian a chance to talk about all the cool stuff that we have at the Centro Library and Archives. I think you should definitely, if you can, make an appointment to come visit the library and archives. You can also schedule a remote appointment if you want to have a one-on-one Zoom chat with me about any research that you want to do. So you can request to have a remote appointment. And definitely click on the links to provide us feedback about what you liked and any comments you might have about this programming that we're doing. So thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of your lunch hour, and we'll see you again in another couple of weeks.
Thank you, Anibal, and thank you everyone for coming. We also invite you to join us this evening for a Body Mix afternoon tertulia on San Juan, a city on both sides of the wall. I will include the chat there for that event. And we also invite you to join us next Tuesday, also at 6 p.m. for the third foundation of San Juan, if you're interested in San Juan, Puerto Rico's history and how the capital was founded and developed. Thank you to our lovely interpreters for all the work that they offer and making sure that our events are as accessible as possible. And to our webmaster / DJ Camacho for creating awesome vibes. We hope you all have a lovely Thanksgiving, and we'll see you for the next library lunch hour, which, if I'm not mistaken, will be on Puerto Rican Christmas. So crack open some coquito and and have some fun with us and celebrate some Puerto Rican Christmas with us.